A braid of golden hair, cut loose. Queen Marika's offering to the Grandmother. Boosts holy negation damage by the utmost. What was her prayer, her wish, her confession? There was no one left to answer, and Marika never returned home again. It's now a certainty that Queen Marika the Eternal of the Lands Between is originally from the Land of Shadow, though this was likely not its original name, and through the birth of the Erd Tree and the Shadow Tree, she was able to hide her homeland from prying eyes. Despite the Land of Shadow likely being the homeland for the Numen race, we don't see much in the Shadow Realm that actually connects to the Numen directly. Sure, a great deal of lore and history was revealed in the Shadow of the Erd Tree DLC, though there is still quite a lot that was left out, whether it was done intentionally or not. In this video, I aim to elucidate as much information about the Numen as I can, from their plight in the Lands of Shadow under the thumb of the Hornsent, to their downfall under the rule of Queen Marika, their supposed savior. The most prominent Numen in Elden Ring is of course Queen Marika, with the majority of the history of the Lands Between revolving around her ascending to godhood and the creation of the Golden Order of the Erd Tree. While players can choose to play as a male Numen, we only see female Numen in-game, such as Marika and the Black Knife Assassins. It then stands to reason that all of Marika's children are at least half Numen, such as the children she had with Godfrey, or the loads of children Marika used as sacrifices in the past. These of course refer to the corpses in the wandering mausoleums that grant the ability to duplicate Ashes of Remembrance. However, these wandering mausoleums are only present in the Lands Between, which may suggest that Marika evolved her method of burying her children, as there are several of these corpses that may be Marika's Numen offspring in the Land of Shadow as well, but they did not receive the honor of having their bodies protected in wandering mausoleums. Instead, these bodies were left in open burial sites across the plains of the Shadow Realm. Marika may not have always been so kind with her children, and that doesn't seem to have changed much over the long stretches of time, considering her treatment of children like Mohg and Morgott. Aside from the children of Marika, the only other male Numen that may be present in the Lands Between is Radagon. While Radagon is still a wild card, and it's difficult to ever clearly pinpoint his exact relation to Marika and how they came to be one being, it very well may be the case that he is a Numen, and perhaps this allowed Marika to merge with him, as Numen seem to be special beings in the Lands Between. They do not originate directly from the Lands Between, and are said to originate from another world, and based on translation, this could be in reference to another world or spirit realm of some sort. Moreover, in Japanese the Numen are referred to as Marabito, which literally means rare person. Marabito are spiritual creatures in Japanese folklore that come from the everlasting otherworld called Tokuyo no Kuni, which has several interpretations, though it's seen as different from an afterlife and is a mysterious mystical realm. Marabito are typically described as bringing knowledge and good fortune, though it's clear Marika only brought good fortune to those who fell in line with the greater will in the Erd Tree. Though, as I mentioned, Radagon could perhaps be a Numen, as many have speculated, as we don't know exactly where he came from or what he was doing prior to Godfrey's reign as Elden Lord, and is ultimately one with Marika, who herself is of Numen stock. The Numen people appear to be quite large naturally, as Marika is around 9 feet tall, as is Radagon, and virtually each one of Marika's children boasts an incredible stature as well. Lest we forget, Radon is not the only large child of Marika, as even Ranni's corpse is seen to be quite large, despite her spectral form being the size of an average human. The textual evidence seems to point at Numen being particularly special among the races of the Lands Between, not only in their name, but in their size and relation to godhood, as Marika was a Numen able to ascend to the status of a god, and her children are demigods one and all. While perhaps not all Numen may be Empyreans, or may be capable of becoming Empyreans, they are a people intrinsically connected to divinity, and are the only race we know of to actually assume godhood other than perhaps dragons. Though, even then, it's still unclear if any dragons attain the status of godhood, as Placidusax was the Elden Lord of his era, and we still know so little about the god he was connected to that eventually fled his side. The Hornsent were a people that saw themselves as connected to divinity through their growth of horns, yet their blood, much like omens, was tainted and led to various afflictions that they could not entirely stave off, such as the man-fly transformation, lamenters, or even possibly the blood fiends. As they themselves were tainted, yet wanted so desperately to reach divinity, they attempted to lead the Numen people into so-called sainthood by jamming them together in jars. Attire of the shamans who perform their worship at jails increases the power of thrown pots of all sizes. They offer their prayers to the innards of the great jars, such that they might be reborn one day into sainthood. This is the cycle of death and rebirth, taken into the hands of mortal men. The Numen people are predisposed to become Empyreans, those that can become a god and vessel for the Elden Ring. Information surrounding Empyreans is still somewhat cloudy, as is the process for an Empyrean to actually become a god, though we know of 4 Empyreans other than Marika: Ranni, Malenia, Miquella, and Messmer. Marika was once an Empyrean and became a god through the assistance of a consort in the Greater Will. While uncertain if this was the only way for an Empyrean to achieve godhood, it would seem as though only those with Numen blood have been capable of obtaining the coveted title of Empyrean. Ranni is a child of Radagon, and as Radagon is Marika, she is at least half Numen. Malenia, Miquella, and Messmer were born to both Marika and Radagon, thus they would almost certainly have full Numen blood coursing through their veins, as Marika had children with her other self, better known as Radagon. Moreover, they are all afflicted with some sort of curse, and I wonder if perhaps Marika herself possesses a curse of some kind as she was an Empyrean. I wonder if full-blooded Numen always have the potential to reach godhood, and this could again help explain how Radagon could become a god that is one with Marika. As Marika says about Radagon, he was not always Marika, he was not always a god. And, while he was not always one with Marika nor a god, he is eventually merged in some capacity with Marika and achieves godhood through her body, and they produce several Empyrean children with afflictions. O Radagon, leal hound of the Golden Order, thou art yet to become me, and thou art yet to become a god. Let us be shattered, both, mine other self. From the Shadow of the Erd Tree DLC, we now know that Marika hails from the shaman village in the Lands of Shadow, and the people of her village were oppressed by the Hornsent of the Belurat Tower settlement. This almost certainly feeds into Marika's hatred of the Crucible, as the Hornsent stuffed Numen into jars as a form of ritual so that they could reach divinity. The Hornsent are intrinsically linked to the Crucible, with their horns being seen as symbols of the Crucible. While the Numen settled in the shaman village, they are still originally from outside the Lands of Shadow, meaning they come from outside the influence of the Crucible, and thus they do not present the typical traits of having been touched by the Crucible, such as horns or feathers. As the Numen did not possess traits of the primordial Crucible, they were oppressed and subjugated by the Hornsent, stuffing them into the living jars in a ritualistic attempt to bring the Numen closer to the divinity of the Crucible. The Crucible is described as an amalgamation of life, when everything was blended together. So it stands to reason that the Hornsent were attempting to have the Numen touch divinity, for them to interact with the Crucible in some manner through mashing them together in jars. While not explicitly stated, the Numen are placed into these jars with other Numen in hopes they will begin to take on traits of the Crucible as they become amalgamations of living flesh within the jars. It's not entirely clear if the aim was simply to subjugate the Numen and perpetuate the Hornsent's spiritual practices, or if it was a legitimate attempt from the Hornsent to convert the Numen into creatures of the Crucible. Regardless, the Numen were severely persecuted, and this most definitely led Marika to seek power, to seek godhood and assistance from an outer god like the Greater Will. And, as I mentioned, this likely influenced Marika's treatment of her own children that were born as omens. Marika's omen children, as well as other omens in the Lands Between, are remnants of the Crucible's influence, and this influence even affected Marika's children, albeit not all of them. Still, it stands to reason that when individuals continued to be born with horns and marks of the Crucible, Marika saw it as an omen, a sign or warning of what she viewed as a lingering evil, as adherents of the Crucible had decimated her people. While clearly not a perfect analog, the Numen seem somewhat reminiscent of the plights that the Jewish people have endured. Many have discussed Elden Ring symbolizing the shift from polytheism to the monotheism of Abrahamic religions like Judaism and Christianity. And Marika and the Numen fit into this well, as they are a minority that are severely persecuted for not aligning with the religious and cultural views of the time. Yet their god eventually becomes the dominant deity of the land through the actions of Marika, a Christ-like figure that transforms the religion and culture of the land, and is herself a god, like Jesus is both the Son and the Father in Christianity. Marika herself is a Numen, much like Jesus is Jewish, yet a new order and religion is formed around her and spreads in her name. Just as Christianity spreads from the actions and teachings of Jesus, and this new religion is not solely connected to the Numen nor the Jewish people, and is a new set of laws that are intended to supersede the old order. Of course, a good amount of this is my own personal interpretation and speculation of the symbolism of the game's story and factions, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. To get back on track, I find it fascinating that the village the Numen settled is named the Shaman Village, as shamans are believed to be people that can achieve various spiritual powers through trance states or ecstatic religious experiences. These are said to be religious experiences in which a person experiences an altered state of consciousness characterized by reduced external awareness and increased internal awareness, introspection, spiritual awareness, and a sense of glee or euphoria. Generally speaking, in monotheistic traditions such as Judaism or Christianity, the idea of religious ecstasy typically relates to communion and oneness with God. I find all this interesting when discussing the Numen and the Shaman Village, as there are so many clues that point to the Numen having a deep spiritual connection with some other force or outer god that is unrelated to the Crucible. And while the abilities of shamanism vary from culture to culture, it typically involves the ability to heal the sick, to communicate with the other world, and often to escort the souls of the dead to that other world. The Japanese name of the Numen means rare people, and they are named after benevolent spirits that would supposedly aid towns and villages. Moreover, the word Numen is actually Latin in origin, and a more modern definition from Merriam-Webster defines Numen as a spiritual force or influence often identified with a natural object, phenomenon, or place. However, when looking through a Latin dictionary, the word Numen can also be used to mean the divine will, the will or power of the gods, divine sway, or godhead, divinity, deity, divine majesty. The word Numen is intrinsically linked to the idea of spirituality, divinity, and godhood, just as the Numen people in the lands between are depicted. The title of Numen was even occasionally bestowed upon Roman rulers to identify them as having been chosen by God to rule. Interestingly, Marika, a Numen, was chosen by the Greater Will to become a god and lead a crusade against the Hornsent to bring about a new age. Marika and the other Numen were inhabitants of another world or realm, and their apparent connection to shamanism strengthens the idea that they have some sort of connection to another realm or other world outside the lands between. Moreover, shamanism deals with the guiding of souls to the other world, and this is something Marika, again a Numen, effectively offered as a service through the birth of the Erd Tree, as souls are escorted and hewn into the tree, acting almost as a new form of afterlife. As I've been saying, it's still unclear if the Numen actually originate in the Land of Shadow. It's very likely that Marika could have been born in the Shaman Village, though, as they are seen as radically different from others touched by the Crucible, it would suggest that they originate from outside the Land of Shadow, and possibly from an entirely another world or dimension. The face of the Numen, supposed descendants of denizens of another world, long-lived but seldom born. This of course ties into the Numen's Japanese name Marabito, as Marabito are spiritual visitors that come from another realm, Tokoyo. Perhaps the Numen have been residing in the Land of Shadow for generations, though it likely is not their origin point, especially when considering the item description of Marika's hammer. Stone hammer made in the lands of the Numen, outside the lands between. The tool with which Queen Marika shattered the Elden Ring, and Radagon attempted to repair it. The hammer partially broke upon shattering the ring, becoming splintered with rune fragments. Marika's hammer, a Numen weapon, was crafted outside the lands between in the lands of the Numen. Much like other people seeking the Elden Ring, the Numen very well could have come from an unseen land that exists beyond the lands between, like the Land of Reeds. Regardless of where the Numen are from originally, they are a powerful people that were oppressed until Marika rose up and became a god through the assistance of a consort and outer god, elevating her people to new heights. However, I don't believe that it remained this way for long. Like many others, I believe the Numen to have a very close connection to the Nox, and they may in fact simply be the Nox, having abandoned or forgotten the Numen name. While I believe much of what I'm about to say to be backed up by textual evidence, there is still the generous amount of speculation here. I doubt the Numen would have forgotten their name or the plights they endured, though I can see why they would rename themselves after Marika created the Golden Order. We know that the Nox and the inhabitants of the Eternal Cities, in general, were at one point in opposition to the Greater Will, having betrayed it by attempting to create their own Elden Lord, a Lord of Night. Long ago, the Nox invoked the ire of the Greater Will, and were banished deep underground. Now they live under a false night sky, in eternal anticipation of their liege, of the coming age of the stars, and their Lord of Night. Though, why would they be doing this? And how could the Black Knife assassins that slew Godwyn be both Numen and scions of the Eternal Cities? Well, it's simple. The Nox and the Numen are one and the same. Of course, this is my personal theory, though I believe it's supported by the presence of Numen runes throughout the lands between in various locations, and the previously mentioned fact that the Black Knife assassins that murdered Godwyn were Numen women that supposedly had ties to Queen Marika and were also scions of the Eternal Cities. While scion can also refer to plant biology, it refers to someone who is a descendant of a particularly noble or significant family. Thus, when the Black Knife assassins are described as scions of the Eternal Cities, it implies that they hail from the Eternal Cities, that this is where their families reside, and these families and cities were once of great importance. Moreover, the Black Knife assassins are quite large, much like Marika. It would make sense that if the Numen no longer worshipped the Greater Will, that they may have tried to usurp Marika's reign, and this could help explain why the Numen are still so few in number, even after Marika effectively snuffed out the Hornsent and ushered in a new era. The thing is, while Numen in general may have lost trust in the Greater Will with time, it's likely that Marika did as well, especially if the Greater Will punished her people residing in the ancient cities. The Eternal Cities committed treason against the Greater Will, though it's possible that so too did Marika, as she was perhaps involved in the plot to kill Godwyn, lighting the spark that would destroy the Golden Order, and removed the Rune of Destined Death from the Elden Ring, and then went even further, shattering the ring and then employing the blacksmith Hugh to craft a god-slaying weapon that was almost certainly intended to be used to free Marika of the Greater Will's influence. Based on available information, it's very possible that Marika became a god with the assistance of the Greater Will to free her oppressed people, yet the Greater Will continued to puppet her. She maybe became a god with the noblest of intentions in mind, yet the Greater Will influenced her to go much further than freeing her own people, as she would go on to subjugate and purge those with a connection to the Crucible, including her own children born with aspects of that Crucible. The Eternal Cities seem to have been focused on accruing power that could rival that of the Greater Wills, and it feels reminiscent of how the Numen fought against the Hornsent and the Crucible in the Lands of Shadow. Marika fought to free her people, yet she may have ultimately put her people in a position in which they had to choose freedom or siding with the Greater Will, and because they did not wish to bend the knee to the Greater Will, the cities were destroyed, effectively destroying Marika's own race. An event like this could have even fueled Marika's own disdain for the Greater Will and desire to free herself from its control. If the Numen are the inhabitants of the Eternal Cities that were destroyed by the Greater Will, then it would be all the more reason for Marika to turn away from the Greater Will, and all the more reason for her to conspire with the Black Knife assassins to end the Golden Order. The description of Marika's golden braid also refers to the grandmother that she offered the braid to, and while this could be a localization oddity, I find it interesting that the item description refers to a matriarchal figure such as the grandmother, rather than her grandmother. It does not specifically say that this was actually Marika's blood relative grandmother. This leads me to believe that the Numen were a matriarchal society, at least to some capacity, as grandmother appears to be a significant title and role among the Numen people, as Marika gave this braid to that figure as an offering of some sort, suggesting there to have been a hierarchical structure that perhaps placed the one with the title of grandmother at the tippy top. Furthermore, a great video by Last Protagonist points out that the Japanese kanji used for the shaman village Marika hails from is Miko, which primarily refers to shrine maidens, further hinting at a matriarchal structure among the Numen, as FromSoft specifically wanted us to know that this is a village with a strong female connection. What fascinates me about this is that the Nox of the Eternal Cities are a matriarchal society as well, and while outfit designs almost seem to suggest the opposite, as the female Nox cover their faces, this is actually a sign of religious significance. Crown worn by the sorceresses of the Eternal City. These women are the personal guards of the Night Maidens, and the silk hides their eyes. Twin crowns worn by the Night Maidens of the Eternal City indicates the highest clerical rank, and hides the eyes with silk. Based on these descriptions, the Nox sorceresses protect the Night Maidens, and both of these Nox ranks cover their eyes. The covering of the eyes is a spiritually significant practice to the Nox based on their clothing, and the Night Maiden Twin Crown makes it clear that the Night Maidens were the highest ranking member of the Nox clergy. Is it then possible that the Nox and Numen are indeed the same people? Perhaps one branched off from the other, such as the Numen being modern descendants of the Nox, as we still don't actually know where the Numen originate from, just that they settled the shaman village in what is now the Lands of Shadow. Perhaps they were originally Numen that left the Eternal Cities, perhaps even due to the destruction of the cities due to the Greater Will and Estelle, though of course that's unclear. They could have departed the Eternal Cities for whatever reason and eventually settled in the shaman village. Of course, it could also be simply that both societies are just matriarchal, and thus it was just a natural alliance between the Numen and Nox once they came into contact. It's especially interesting that the Nox had a weapon that can be used to slay the Two Fingers, considering they wanted to bring about their Lord of Night, and it's strongly implied that Marika turned her back on her own Numen people, as she never returned to her home village after acquiring power. The Numen in some facet had contact with the Fingers, and the Nox had the weapon to slay said Fingers. Whether or not Marika was involved in the Night of the Black Knives, it is still true that the Black Knife assassins that slew Godwyn were both Numen warriors and scions of the Eternal Cities, meaning there is an undeniable link between the Nox and Numen, one that could run as deep as them being the same people, or simply having formed an alliance over their matriarchal societies, and disdain for Marika and the Greater Will. As many have mentioned before, the presence of the Numen runes in the deep-root depths that drop from slaying giant ants is an interesting detail. To me, it seems to be a clear connection between the Numen and Nox. When exploring the Eternal Cities, many Nox warriors can be seen riding and fighting on the backs of giant ants. Thus, it certainly would seem to me that the Numen and Nox are indeed one and the same, or the Numen moved in and adopted the same ant-riding practices and had a close alliance. This could very well explain this seemingly random detail, as it would tie the Numen directly to other subterranean ant-riding people. Another small detail about the Black Knife Assassins and the Nox is that their armor is actually quite similar, as both wear scaled armor. While they still differ somewhat in appearance, the Black Knife Assassin wardrobe is actually quite similar to that of the Nox sorceresses and Night Maidens. Of course, as the Black Knife Assassins are Numen women, it seems to again just be another link between these groups. The Eternal Cities also have a great deal of Ghostflame, which suggests that the Nox did follow the same death practices that were performed long ago across the Lands Between and in the Lands of Shadow. The Numen come from a time that precedes the Greater Will, at least in its influence, as do the Nox, as is seen by their reliance on the Ghostflame and their connection to an ancient civilization lost to time. The Nox could simply be the Numen that were outcast by the Greater Will for not falling in line and accepting the Erdtree, which could also explain their appearance, as they haven't seen sunlight in possibly hundreds of years, if not longer. On the other hand, Numen are typically fair-skinned and have golden hair, yet it would stand to reason that generations underground beneath a false night sky would lead to physical adaptations that would alter their appearance and transform them into what we know as the Nox. This could also help explain why so little is known about them, as the less we know about Marika's people and the history prior to the Erdtree, the more effectively the Greater Will can keep up the facade that the Erdtree is the true sole religion and order of the land. It would also stand to reason that if the Numen had once produced Marika, an Empyrean that befriended the Two Fingers and became a god, then perhaps they believed they could recreate this process with the assistance of another outer god, likely one connected to the moon or stars. Of course, the inhabitants of the Eternal Cities were also aware of the power of the dragons that came before, and this was another way they sought power with which to usurp Marika and the Greater Will. If they were once the people of Marika, I also like the idea that the Nox would have turned away from faith and incantations because of Marika and the Greater Will, and instead chose to focus on intelligence and sorcery, once again going against the Erdtree and the Greater Will itself. Of course, the Nox and Numen being one and the same is by no means a certain fact, though it's clear there is a connection between them that has been difficult to snuff out thus far. I could see them being the same race, but I could also see them just being close allies, two magically gifted, matriarchal societies that teamed up. Moreover, as Marika does seem to be implicated in the Night of the Black Knives and has tasked Hugh with crafting a weapon capable of killing a god, and that the Fingerslayer blade is found in the Eternal Cities, it seems to point to the connection between the Nox and Numen possibly extending to Marika, as she has wanted to free herself from the Greater Will's influence for quite some time. Where better to seek those answers than in the supposedly destroyed Eternal Cities? Cities that have been experimenting with dragon creation and have the ability to slay an Empyrean's Two Fingers, two things that could have possibly freed Marika at one point in time. Moreover, the Nox had items like mirror helms. Helm fashioned from a crystal looking glass, one among the Eternal City's ritual implements, easily broken and weak against striking attacks. Worn by those committed to high treason, it wards off the intervention of the Greater Will and its vassal fingers. If it's the case that Marika waged war against the Hornsent after she exiled Godfrey and married Radagon, it would make sense that the Nox could be displeased that it was taking Marika so long to eradicate the people that had oppressed the Numen for so long, and eventually perhaps would turn against Marika given enough time. After all, Mesmer is a child of Marika and Radagon, implying Marika waged war in the Lands of Shadow after conquering the rest of the lands between, long after the Hornsent began turning the Numen into the Jarsent. If Marika did not immediately save her own people, then perhaps those people soured toward Marika and her outer god. Whatever the connection is, though, the Nox and Numen are both seemingly working together against the Greater Will, and most certainly have ties to Queen Marika. While Marika effectively rejects the idea of intelligence-based sorcery, opting for faith-based incantations, I find it interesting that Ymir's headpiece says it represents the Greater Will and the lightless abyss within it, and that it raises both faith and sorcery, suggesting that the current order Marika and the Greater Will have established may go against the actual natural order in some fashion, and I wonder if this in some way ties into the Mother of Fingers, though that's for another day. The Hat of Count Ymir, High Priest. The circular design at the top represents the Greater Will and its lightless abyss, imparting increased intelligence and arcane to the wearer. Though Count Ymir instructed R'hllana in the sorcerous arts, he abandoned his allegiance to the moon. It was merely the closest of the celestial bodies, nothing more. I just find it interesting that Ymir's attire suggests that the Greater Will may be tied to both faith and intelligence, and I wonder if this could connect to the proposed schism between the Two and Three Fingers, and if it could in some way be related to the potential division that occurred among the Numen people during Marika's uprising, leading to the formation of the Nox in the Eternal Cities. The Nox of the Eternal Cities studying sorcery and the stars is the opposite route that Marika took, opting for a faith-based approach and perhaps communing with the Greater Will. The Nox appear to have been trying to commune with an outer god as well, perhaps one connected to the moon, stars, or night sky, going against the golden radiance of the Greater Will and the Erdtree. As sorcery may not be wholly separate from the Greater Will itself, I especially find it fascinating that the Greater Will banished the Nox, though I suppose something about attempting to commune with the moon doesn't sit right with the Greater Will for some reason. Ymir's helm also states that he abandoned the moon as it was simply the closest celestial body and nothing more, and this is likely the true reason the Nox/Numen were banished, as the Greater Will doesn't want anyone worshipping another outer god, whether real or not. Thus, the Nox and perhaps Numen turning to study sorcery connected to the stars and moon meant they had committed treason against the Greater Will. Marika and the Greater Will were focused on faith and gold, whereas the Nox/Numen were focused on intelligence and silver, as is seen in the presence of the silver mimic tears and husks littered throughout the Eternal Cities. I believe they wanted to create a new Empyrean and Lord of Night to oppose Marika because she turned against her own people, invoking the same type of divinity as the Hornsent. The Hornsent use divine invocations to invite spirits and gods to channel power through them, and their abilities are faith-based incantations much like Marika's and the Elden Beast. The Crucible is the primordial form of the Erdtree, and thus both are connected to faith. The Hornsent, the people that oppressed Marika and the Numen, use very similar abilities to that of Marika when she ascends to godhood, and if the Crucible is simply the primordial form of the Erdtree, then it's especially interesting that Marika and the Greater Will seem to despise it so much, as the Erdtree comes from the Crucible. Marika is effectively harnessing the power of the Crucible to fight against those that worship the Crucible, and seemingly never truly assisted her people and raised them out of their oppression. I could see how this wouldn't have been favored by the Numen, as they were seen as having come from outside the influence of the Crucible, and whether or not that's true, I can't imagine they were too deeply in love with the very thing that led the Hornsent to persecuting their people. The Hornsent deeply admire the Crucible and their direct connection to it, and this is why they stuff the Numen in great jars, turning them into what last protagonist calls the Jarsent. So, it would stand to reason that Marika harnessing the same power that led to their destruction as a people would sow discord among Marika and other Numen. Again, much of this comes from my own speculation, though I think many pieces fit quite nicely. However, in general, there is still a great deal we can't explain about the Eternal Cities themselves. The presence of the giant corpses sitting atop massive thrones is certainly something about the cities that is difficult to reconcile with what we know about the Nox in these cities. First off, the buildings in the Eternal Cities are not designed for massive beings like the corpses sitting in the thrones, suggesting they did not build the Eternal Cities, though clearly they played some prominent role in their history, otherwise they wouldn't have been gifted thrones. As far as I am aware, there is nothing in the game that discusses who or what these corpses are, or what their relation to the Nox or the Eternal Cities is. They could simply be giants, but their presence doesn't quite fit with a fire giant's appearance, and they are much too large to be trolls, especially as the Dragonkin Soldier of Noxtella was created using a troll, and it is much smaller than the giant's corpse. It's honestly so out of place considering the size of the inhabitants of the Eternal Cities, and the fact that no reference is made to them in the armor descriptions of the Nox. The giant's corpse in Nokron is specifically in the Night Sacred Ground section of the city, which does seem to suggest that these giants had some sort of spiritual significance to the Nox for some reason. Regardless, it's not obvious how they tie into the larger story of the Nox and the Numen, as the closest association we have to that is Radagon and his children having red hair that may be a result of a curse from the fire giants. While Nokron has larger humanoid bodies that seem to be sticking out of the buildings crying for help, these people are still much smaller than the giant's corpse, and I wonder if these larger bodies are in fact the Numen from hundreds or thousands of years ago that were killed when the city was banished. These corpses look more along the size of Marika and Radagon, very large humanoids but not quite the size of trolls or giants. Moreover, the doorways in the Eternal Cities appear as though they would have been crafted for large beings. Perhaps these giants are the denizens of another world that Numen descend from, and this could explain their unusual size and why their corpses have been idolized. Were the giants already here, long dead when the Nox or Numen settled the region, or are they intrinsically linked? Who's to say? More than that, the presence of older architecture and the ancestral followers and shamans is quite intriguing, as they seem to be thriving despite the destruction of the Eternal Cities. They have a connection to spirits in Ghostflame, though it's unclear why they would be residing right next to the Eternal Cities, and perhaps were not bothered by their destruction. Yet, it's also very possible that like the giant corpses, the ancestral followers may have already been residing underground, and the cities being banished underground is why Nokron and the Ancestral Woods are so close to one another. Nokron may have even displaced some of the natural geography of the land, and this could be why traversing between Nokron and the Ancestral Woods can be a bit treacherous. There seems to be the presence of even older civilizations than the Nox down in the depths of the lands between, ones that have ancient structures and worship practices that predate the Erd Tree, especially when considering the prevalence of Ghostflame. The ancestral woods outside of Nokron also share a destroyed bridge that would have connected it to the area that Mohg is using to start his dynasty. Statues of Nox women holding Ghostflame torches can be found in the Eternal Cities, suggesting that the Nox still practice the death and burial rituals that were prevalent prior to the birth of the Erd Tree, a time before the reign of Marika. In fact, these are practices that Marika's people in the Shaman village may have even practiced, as this was quite common everywhere in the Lands Between, including the Lands of Shadow. And while I have said that the Nox or Numen are against Marika, they are more so enemies of the Greater Will, as even Marika in many ways was little more than a puppet for the Greater Will. If Marika truly was in some way responsible for the Night of the Black Knives or conspired in it, then it's possible the destruction and banishment of the Eternal Cities was entirely the fault of the Greater Will's intervention, rather than an act of Marika, especially if she had been conspiring with the Eternal Cities to slay the Greater Will. Remember, Marika is being imprisoned in the Erd Tree by the Greater Will, so the two of them are not on the best of terms as of late, and I don't think it to be too far-fetched to think Marika may have been trying to slay the Greater Will and free herself, and ultimately, her people, by working with the Nox in secret to craft a new kind of lord, one not tied to the Greater Will, and a new kind of weapon that can slay both Two Fingers and gods. Marika turned her back on her own people in an attempt to end the reign of the oppressive Hornsent, yet she herself ushered in genocide and persecution, arguably at a much greater scale than the Hornsent ever had. The Greater Will was a means to an end, but the Greater Will was not done with Marika once they eradicated the Hornsent. It wanted to conquer all of the Lands Between. Perhaps Marika did not truly abandon her people, but was unable to truly be their savior due to the influence of the Greater Will. So, what do we know? We know that Marika hails from the Shaman village in the Lands of Shadow, a realm that was created and hidden away when Marika rose to power with the assistance of the Greater Will, birthing both the Erd Tree and Shadow Tree. As item descriptions suggest, Marika's stock, the Numen, likely originate from beyond the Shaman village and the Lands Between, arriving from an unnamed land of the Numen, and perhaps descended from godlike beings, considering their propensity toward Empyrean status, physical stature, as well as their long lives. This may also tie into their name Marabito, which hints at them being otherworldly beings, or at least descended from them. The Numen were also somewhat unique to the Lands of Shadow, as they did not possess features or aspects of the Crucible. Thus, the Hornsent of the Lands of Shadow oppressed and persecuted the Numen people, causing them to die, mutate into an amalgamation of flesh, or become living jars, which also raises the question of whether or not all living jars, including Alexander, are actually Numen that achieved the so-called sainthood the Hornsent were seeking. The Hornsent continued to imprison Numen within jars, simply for their race and lack of connection to the Crucible. This went on for some time, as can be seen by the empty Shaman village, and the jails filled with great jars containing the remains of the Numen people. Marika at some point befriended the Fingers and began to commune with the Greater Will, and as she was an Empyrean, was able to become a god, perhaps at the same gate of divinity that Mikola was attempting to use. Marika assumed godhood and slew the ancient dragons, giants, and then the Hornsent, waging wars that lasted eons and solidified her as the most significant figure in the history of the Lands Between. The Numen people may also be a matriarchal society, much like the Nox of the Eternal Cities, who many, including myself, have theorized are related to the Numen in some way. The Black Knife Assassins are both Numen and scions of the Eternal Cities, implying a connection between the two groups, as well as more minute connections, such as the presence of Numen runes on giant ants in the Deeproot Depths. As so much time has passed since the banishment of the Eternal Cities, and Marika has been obscuring the history of the Lands Between, it's difficult to nail down the relationship between the Numen and Nox with the utmost certainty. However, it's clear based on the available evidence that there is an undeniable connection between these two matriarchal societies. I have also heard some suggest that the architecture of the Eternal Cities is reminiscent of the buildings in Lane Dell, and this may also be a sign that the Nox had a deeper connection with Marika and the Numen, as they may have been of the same stock. As the Shaman village suggests, Marika and the Numen are skilled in faith-based magic, and can produce Empyreans, those that can ascend to godhood, when particular conditions are met. The Numen are a fascinating people, and they produce the most influential person in all of the lands between, one that rose from a meager beginning to become known as the Eternal Queen, progenitor of the Erd Tree and Golden Order, and vessel of the Elden Ring, the supreme artifact of the realm. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if there was anything I left out or missed, and I will try to do a follow-up video on it soon if I feel like there's a substantial amount that I just totally missed out on or forgot to mention in this one. The Numen and Nox are definitely some of my favorite mysteries to delve into in Elden Ring, and I really hope we can someday get more information on them, whether that comes from another DLC or Elden Ring 2, however unlikely those may be. Though we could also get more information from Miyazaki himself at some point, but regardless of all that, I appreciate you watching until the end, and if you enjoyed it, then go ahead and give the video a like and subscribe to the channel if you aren't already. Till next time, I've been Noctugal. Peace out.